Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. In this episode of Blazor Train, I'll show you how to create self-aware components. That is, components that respond when they come in and out of view. I'll talk about the reasons why you might need self-aware components. I'll show you how to use a free component library to implement self-aware components. And I'll show you how to build your own custom self-aware components specific to a particular page or feature of your Blazor app. And that's all coming up right now, right here on Blazor Train. Before we get started, I'd like to point you to my GitHub repo at carlfranklin/Blazor self-aware components. Here I have written out what's essentially a blog post in the README about how to go through the whole process of everything I'm going to show you today. So if you go to blazortrain.com and look for episode 73 and you click on the download link for the code, it's going to bring you here. To make the case for why we need self-aware components, we have to look at existing behavior. So I've got a Blazor server application here. You can follow along with me. It doesn't matter what you call it. And we're just going to go to the index page, and I'm going to add a div. So this div right here calls this read-only property called unaware div content. Every time we read it, we're going to update a count, unaware count, and we're going to then return the string unaware content called how many times, however many times it's been called. So let's see what happens. Okay, so the unaware content was called 1 time. Now, if I hide it and then show it again, it's still only called 1 time. In fact, it's rendered before this page even loads. Let me show you. I'm going to add some more breaks here, a bunch of them, and we'll put a breakpoint right here and run it again. All right, so before anything even displays, it's called. And it's called twice because we're in pre-rendered mode, which I'm going to turn off in a minute. So this guy has already been rendered once, and that's it. But what if you want your div or your component or whatever to only render when it comes into view? Like this. Now, right? Well, that's what we're going to create today. Self-aware components. Now, there are reasons why you would want to do this. And for that, let's go back to the documentation. So this is the actual library that I'm using. It's called Blazor Intersection Observer. And this is a wrapper around the Intersection Observer API, which is built into the browsers. See, this is MDM Web Docs right here. And so here is the list of cases in which you might need this kind of thing. Lazy loading of images or other content as a page is scrolled. Now there is lazy loading in Blazor, but as you'll see, we get some more control here. Implementing an infinite scrolling website, kind of like Facebook, where more and more content is loaded and rendered as you scroll, so the user doesn't have to flip through pages. This is a big one. Reporting of visibility of advertisements in order to calculate ad revenues. Wow, wouldn't it be good to know how many times a particular element was viewed? And deciding whether or not to perform tasks or animation processes based on whether or not the user will see the result. So these are all good reasons why you want to have self-aware components at times. So in my demo, the first thing I'm going to do, yes, you guessed it, I'm going to change server pre-rendered to server. And let's add our NuGet package. Now the documentation of Blazor Intersection Observer has a link to the NuGet page, and you can just use that. Okay, now that I have that package there, I'm going to add a global using statement to program. Global usings have to go at the top. And now I'm also going to add the service. All right, so that takes care of our program CS. Let's also add these using statements to underscore imports Razor. Now I've got two statements here, Blazor intersection observer components and API, required for what we're going to do right now in index. All right, so I'm going to start by talking about this guy right here, image element. This is an element reference, and this is built into Microsoft ASP.NET Core components, and it basically gives you a reference to an HTML element, right? And you can see right here, my image, I've got the ref pointing to image element. So essentially, this becomes a reference to this. Now, the URL for this is a random image of Nicolas Cage. I got this from the README file in the documentation, and it's on GitHub. Why change a good thing? Let's look up here that we're injecting the I_observer service as observer service, right? So to use the service, you have to wait until the first render, because that's when we know the JavaScript engine is completely set up and ready to be called. So here we're calling observe. We're telling the service to observe this element and then call this handler with entries, which is a list of intersection observer entry. And the first one will be for image element. And this is, I'm calling this image entry, and I'm saving it at the class level so I can access it, intersection observer entry. This is where you need the API, right there. So anytime that the image comes into view or goes out of view, this is going to fire, and we're going to simply call state has changed to refresh the view. And the reason we have to is why? Because this comes from JavaScript, and it's not something that started as a Blazor interaction. So therefore, if we don't do state has changed, nothing will update. And we have some markup code here to say if image entry is not null and we're intersecting, in other words, it's visible, we're going to say the image is visible, otherwise the image is not visible. So let's just kick this off. Now, keep in mind that this isn't exactly how you're going to end up using this library, but I wanted to start with the service just to show you what it can do. So don't get stuck on the implementation and how you would use this in the real world just yet. But check it out. You know, here's our random picture of Nicolas Cage. And as soon as it goes out of view, boop, image is not visible. Nope, now it is. Now it's not. Now it is. Yada, yada, yada. Now, all or nothing seems rather limiting, doesn't it? How can I get control when maybe half of it is visible? How can I know that half of it is visible? Maybe the whole thing has to be visible in order for that to change. Well, let's make a little change here, and we can introduce intersection observer options. Intersection observer options allow you to specify the element that you want to observe. And if you leave it to null, it becomes the parent element. And the threshold, which is an array of doubles. And this is what I want to focus on here. I have numbers going from 0 to 1 every 10%. And what it means is when any one of these percentages of the image is visible, we want to fire this event. Now, how do we know what percentage is visible? Well, on this entry, there's a property called intersection ratio. And so if it's visible, we'll show how much of it is visible. And to specify the options, we do that down here where we're calling this observe method right there to specify the options. All right, let's try this. Okay, so every 10%, we're getting a new value there. Now, how usable is this? Well, I don't know, but there may be a case where you need to know, you want to check to see if the whole thing is visible, right? So if the whole thing is visible, this should be 1. Let me make some room here. There you go. And you may only want to, do your refresh or whatever based on this ratio. It's just another tool in the API that you can use. Now, it's not very useful, I think, to observe elements from the outside. What's more interesting to me is for an element to be self-aware, for it to know when it's visible, so it can render itself, right? So let's make another modification. And here we've got one of the built-in intersection observe elements. So this is a component that's built into the Blazor intersection observer library. And here's how you use it. You create an element inside, and you have to tell the context what element you want to observe, and you do that with ref. So you have this built-in context, and you have a ref current, and you set that. You're essentially setting context ref current to this reference of this div. And then you can check to see if the context is intersecting. In other words, is it visible? And then you can render whatever you want. Now, I didn't think the demo was all that great. So here's what they have as a demo. If the context is intersecting, they say in view, and if not, they say out of view. Well, I got a question for you. When do you ever see out of view? So I don't think this example really drives home what the power of this intersection observe is. So what I did was I called this get dynamic div content, and it returns, hey, I'm here at, and the timestamp, so that we can tell when it changed. So let's try this. There you go. I'm here at 4:42:41. Hide it. Show it again. 4:42:49. Cool, huh? 56, 58, 4:43:01. So that is more like it, right? It's completely self-contained. Well, we can go a little bit further with this. Because what if I now want to have options like I had with the Nicolas Cage image? I want to set thresholds and things. Yes, intersection observe has an options parameter. So here's a little bit of a change. I've got an options down here defined as a new intersection observer options, and I've got my list again with the steps every 10% from 0 to 100. And I've got my get dynamic div content again. But this time I'm showing the entry intersection ratio. And I made it a little bit bigger so that we could see all of this content. All right, so fully visible. And there you go. And you can see our time stamp is changing as well. All right, now I want to show you some curious behavior that happens when we mix the code that we had with the Nicolas Cage image with one of these intersection observe components. And I want you to take a look at the behavior. First of all, let's change the code. Right, so here's our image element with the picture of Nicolas Cage, and right above that is an intersection observe. Notice we don't have any options here. We're just saying when we got rendered, and we have all the old UI up here that with the intersection ratio and all that, which means that yes, we're setting up the observer with these options, and let's just run it and see what happens. Okay, all right, well I see as I change this, the ratio is changing there, but look at this. Why is this changing? Why? Can anyone tell me? You want to think about it for a minute? You want to look at the code? Look at the code. Look at the code. Anyone? Okay. I know you can't answer me unless you're watching this live. But here's the problem right here. We have got this service defined at the page level, right? And so anytime this fires, which is going to be on this threshold 10 times as we go up and down, we're going to call state has changed on the entire page, and that affects components, including intersection observe. So that's why I said that this method, using the observer service, observing from the outside, really isn't all that helpful. So let's focus on intersection observe and components in general. Now, in my opinion, this is too much ceremony. What I really want is a component and then the content that's going to be displayed when it intersects, or when it becomes visible. So let's create in the shared folder a new component called self-aware component. If you've done any work with cascading values and child content, this is a pattern that we can use to create a component that hosts other content. But instead of just showing that child content as a render fragment, what we're doing is wrapping it in an intersection observe. And now we have our cascading value, which is this, meaning this component. And we're only showing the child content if the context is intersecting with this div, right? So this is a nice way that we can wrap up all this goo and clean up our markup where we instantiate this thing. So let's make a modification to index. So here I'm going back to my unaware div content that we had in the very first demo. And now we've got our self-aware component. And I have only the content that I want to show when we come into view. The unaware content has a count. It's called this many times. And the self-aware content has a count. Self-aware content refreshed this many times. And that's what we're calling into right here. All right, let me jack it up a little bit so you can see. Hide them both. Unaware content is still unaware. Self-aware component is aware of itself. It's refreshed twice, 3 times, 4 times. You get it? Now you can see the power of this thing. But let's keep going. Let's use the self-aware component as a child component in another list. We'll leave our unaware div content for the time being. And now I've got a div, and the style includes overflow auto. And that means give me a scroll bar when the content goes beyond the height, which I've specified as 100 pixels. So I've got 11 items up front, and then my self-aware component with the self-aware content. Same as before, but now it's a child component of this div. All right, as we scroll down, refreshed 1 time, refreshed 2 times, etc. Now it's not only within that scroll, but if it's in view, when I hide and show it again, 4 times, 5 times. You see? Powerful stuff. Now, just to prove that multiple components on the same page operate independently, let's do this. I've got a self-aware component as a child component, and I've got another self-aware component outside, each with different content, self-aware content 1 and self-aware content 2. Each have different counters. So we're going to be able to see if they truly behave independently, unlike when we used the service before. 1 time, 2 times, this did not update. 3 times, 1 time, 2 times. So now this is 3 and this is 2. Let's hide and show them both. Now this is 4 and this is 3. Yeah, I would say that is self-aware components operating completely independently of each other. All right, now let's beef up our self-aware component a little bit by adding options. We know that the intersection observe has an options parameter, but we don't have an options parameter. So if we're going to make this reusable, we should add options. Here's my options parameter, intersection observer options. And I simply say options equals at options. Just pass it through. We're going to need to modify our index page. Okay, scrolling down to the bottom, now I have two different intersection observer options. One that has 2 steps and one that has 11 steps. Options 1 and options 2. Otherwise, they're the same. And I still have my counters for each component to get the content. The first one is a child component. The second one is the standalone, just like before. Let's see what happens. Yeah, this one's already refreshed 8 times. Watch this. Boom, 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 boom. 29, boom, 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 41. Whereas down here, 2 times, 4 times, 7 times, 11 times. So you get the idea. This guy is refreshing more often than this one. It's still independently of each other. Now there's more stuff that I can do to self-aware component. Like, for example, can we add a style parameter so I can take out this div here and just add it to the line above? Well, yeah. And while we're at it, let's add a class as well. So now I have a public string class parameter and a public string style parameter so that I can pass those in and we apply them to our master div. Class equals at class, style equals at style. And now in the index, I can get rid of these divs altogether. There we go, much cleaner. And you know what? Why don't we make one of these a different background color just so that we get a visual representation of the difference. Yep, still working. And less ceremony. Well, I'm all about less ceremony, aren't I? So we still have quite a bit of customization to do if we're going to reuse this. It's more likely that in your project, you're going to want to create a component that is specific to a particular page or a particular use case. So let's make a custom component, and I'll call it virtual component. So this is going to be a little self-contained component. We're using intersection observe. We're not going to be passing in child content because we're controlling the content from within. So here I'm showing at virtual content, which is component created at a blah, blah, blah. And if we're not intersecting, I want to show a span with nothing in it. So and the reason for that is I want to show a bunch of these in a list or in a div with overflow set to auto. And if I don't make this component the same height, whether or not it has this virtual content or just a space, which is dependent on whether it's visible or not, the scroll bar is going to go wonky on us. The size of that scroll bar is going to change. It's not going to be very usable. So here it's completely self-contained. If it's visible, we're showing this virtual content, component created at whatever. Otherwise, we're going to show nothing. Now for this demo, I want to take over counter, just so that we can leave all the stuff we have done before intact. So here you go. Here's our counter. We've got a count set to 25 and a for loop that 25 times is going to show a virtual component inside of a div with overflow set to auto, height set to 400. The rest of it doesn't matter. All right, let's see what happens. Counter. Component created at 5:03:03. And you can see that this is changing as I scroll down. So these guys are essentially virtualized. The scroll bar is staying the same height because of that code that shows a space if there's no content. One behavior I'd like to change is that you can see it changes no matter when it gets refreshed. I want it to change once. I want it to initialize only when it comes into view and then keep that content there and not reload every single time it comes into view. Well, it turns out you can do that with this little guy right here. Once. It's a Boolean, or if you just say once, it'll work as well. On intersection observe, and when this is in there, it will render once and then dispose itself. So this is kind of cool if you only want to render yourself once when you come into view. All right, so 50452, remember that. And that is updating as we go down, as we go down, as we go down. 50502, but now as we go back up, 50452, it hasn't changed. So no more rendering. It just renders as you scroll, and then that's it. Well, this is all fine and good, except what if you do want to keep the original content that you rendered, but modify it in some way? All right, so all of the markup stays the same, except I have taken off once. So we're back to rendering every time, except now I have more control over the rendering. I have a virtual content and a backing field. And if that backing field is an empty string, that means this is the first time that we've rendered. So I'm going to create the initial content component created at current time and return it. Otherwise, I'm going to return a modified version of the initial content. So here's the initial content, and then I'm going to append updated at, and then the current time. Now, this is just a demo, but why would you do this? Okay, well, as you're scrolling through Facebook, for example, you will see the content of a post, and that content doesn't change, but what does change is how many minutes, hours, days, months, years ago it was posted. They show that when it refreshes. So as you scroll back, it's going to show, that time elapsed kind of thing. You could do that here too as well, or any kind of metrics that you want to show, or anything at all that you want to append to the original data. Here we go. This one created at 5:08:37, and we go all the way down. 5:08:48, and now as we go back up, you can see that they're refreshing with the updated. However, the created time doesn't change. And that is my demo for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. Now back to you in the studio, Carl. You can get my sample code and instructions right now at this GitHub repo right here. It would be really great if everyone was a little more self-aware, right? Don't get me wrong. I appreciate when a friend says, "Hey, Carl, you got spinach in your teeth." But I'd rather be aware of it myself so I can remove the spinach before anyone notices. Hey, thanks for riding the rails with me today. This is where I jump off. I'll see you next time. Blaze a trail.